All right. Hey, class, how's it going? So here we are, Unit 11. And in Unit 11, we are going to talk about some not the most cheery topics, the rise of fascism, the end of the Roaring Twenties for Europe, the rise of fascism, the beginning of the Depression globally, and then the invention and the use of the first nuclear bomb in World War II. So, as always, we're going to focus on the art, but this period is so rich with massive historical occurrences that we have to pay attention to the history as always. But in this particular case, the history is of utmost importance. So, we're going to start here in Germany in the 1920s. And this is going to be referred to by many historians as the golden years. And so during these golden years, what ends up happening is that we see the German economy post World War II is actually, or post, I'm sorry, post World War One is actually starting to come together, and things are starting to happen in a pretty dynamic and effective way for the Germans. This is by no means to suggest that war reparations are easy or that they're easily overcoming the economic burden that was put on them during World War One, but in many ways, throughout this tumultuous time, Germany is going to be doing very well, especially Berlin and especially the urban areas, more so than the rural areas in many cases. So some historians will correct this and say it's not so much that Germany was actually finding its golden years, it was gold plated. And underneath, it wasn't doing so well. But on the surface, Germany was booming. Berlin at this time was the third largest city in the world. It was arguably one of the most technologically advanced cities and one of the most well educated cities. It was a hotbed for art and social experimentation, and people were living large. And we see during this time that Berlin is going to be kind of a bastion of a term that we would use more today than they would use, but liberalism and perhaps morals that didn't follow the more conservative traditional German values. And so this is going to be one of those kind of cultural values, cultural wars, you could almost say, that will come to a head, that will in some cases, often be attributed to, or at least partially attributed to Hitler's rise. So in the rise of fascism, but by no means the only one. So from an art standpoint, though, we like to see places where people are pushing traditional norms because typically that is where the most cutting edge art, oftentimes the most politically and socially engaged art, critiquing society and critiquing the things um, around the social, the things that are going on in the edge of the social sphere are occurring. And so Berlin is going to be that place, and Berlin is going to have all sorts of interesting art going on. All right. So, what is some of that going to look like? Well, before we jump into what some of that art's going to look like, we have to take a look at what are the social tensions going on. So, remember at the end of World War One, as I mentioned, the end of World War One was really the final death blows to divine right and this notion of primogeniture, where power is passed down from eldest son to eldest son. It had been in the wings. It had been getting beat up ever since the American and French Revolution, and now it's starting to wane. And in the 1920s and 30s, post World War One, Europe is going to wrestle very hard, philosophically, to try to determine what its future is going to look like. Who do you work for becomes the major premise. So in the 1920s, well, really in the late 1800s, let's just say roughly around 1900, more people worked for someone else than worked for themselves for the first time in human history, or at least Western human history. So around 1900, more people work for corporations and for other business owners than they work for themselves. And so the question becomes then, who do you work for? And we know that under any single one of these systems that come out, there's the opportunity for pretty rampant exploitation and abuse of the workers. And as these workers start to look around, and when I say workers, by this I mean a growing middle class throughout the world. And the United States, don't we're not going to delve into the United States, but the United States is going to wrestle with this in its own way. If you look at the displaced Okies in the 1930s, if you look at some of there's the Blair Mountain battle, or the battle for Blair Mountain, where hundreds of coal miners took up arms against the company that they worked for because of unfair working practices in West Virginia. These become complicated questions. And so I want to just break this down in the most simple. You can take political science classes and study this in far more nuance, which is important and helpful. But there's two different top notions that are coming to really gain people's attention. And one is obviously a democratic process where people are elected, and these democratic institutions can take on kind of a social philosophical context where choices are made for the benefit of the society, or priorities are for the benefit of the society. Where in capitalism, it's more about the benefit of the individual. And so there are these two, but they're both, typically, not always, but typically have a democratic approach to them. The other side that's getting a lot of exploration at this time period, and we can see with Hitler and Franco and Mussolini, and a lot of the leaders that are going to be popping up throughout Europe, is that we have fascism and we have communism. And fascism is a an intermingling of this pretty aggressive nationalism. And that is not to say you can't have nationalism over here, but it's a very fervent form of nationalism that also gets into not the nationalism moves into identity. Oftentimes that's racial identity, and this notion of having, under Hitler, of having the superior race. And your nationalism becomes so important that the nation is far more important than the individual over here. The individual matters very little in fascism. What matters is the nation and the power of the nation. And so even corporate interests, corporations fall under nationalized control. It's not communist. It's not for the good of the community, even though that's adulterated and misused, and also authoritarian. But everything ideally is about the power of the nation. And so that's really fascism. And communism over here is again has a both of these become tricky to kind of pin down, because each authoritarian dictatorial person who is in control basically makes up their own version. And so under communism here, the idea is that you have the benefit of the community, not the individual and not the whole society. But and so you can have, socialism seeks to create more egalitarian structures, where communism doesn't necessarily want egalitarian structures if it benefits the community to have people who have far more control of certain things. That's fine. Where socialists would say, no, it really should be society should control what's good for society, and not a few individuals controlling what's good for society. So this is, poli-sci, Mickey Mouse poli-sci here that I'm embarking on. But just understand that all of these throughout Germany, throughout Europe, even in the United States to a smaller extent, people were asking, who do I work for? Who do I want to work for? Who should be in power? Who shouldn't be in power? And this is a tumultuous time where all this is going on. If you look at the Weimar Republic, this is Germany, pre-Nazi Germany, and you look at the way in which their government was created, it was this, attempt at democracy that flowed into an authoritarian style of government, that flowed into fascism and this rampant, you could even say rapid nationalism of race identity. And so it kind of follows this path. So that's the questions that you're going to see these authors and these artists and these playwrights starting to explore. So at this time period, we know from our study thus far that art is often political. It doesn't mean that it always has to be. Art normally has to at least have some pretty important ideas at play that people are wrestling with. But now everything is becoming political. And so this should sound, I think, to many of us a lot more like our modern day world, where unfortunately everything we do has some political connotation attached to it. And this is where that starts to take off in modern. I'm not using that in a modernism, but in a more modern world, in a world where things are happening. So we have Kafka. Kafka's a writer. Some of you may have read Metamorphosis. An office worker wakes up in the first pages of the book, and he's been turned into a cockroach, and he's laying in bed and he realizes that he's a like literally a giant, a man-sized cockroach. And then Kafka writes a bunch of other stories, and he's really interested in where is the individual, what happens. So when you have all of these things happening over here, what happens to the individual? And even in capitalism, in an abusive capitalistic society, even the individual becomes less important than the money. And so, even in our country today, we're constantly wrestling between what's more important, the rights of the individual or the profits of the corporation. And so Kafka is asking in all of these structures, where is the individual and what's the role of the individual? And when you become, a factory worker in, let's say, fascist Germany, or you become a, a worker in communist Russia, what happens to the individual? And what worth does the individual have? So, as you can imagine, if you look back, romanticism is going back to those romantic ideals. These authors aren't exactly engaging in that, but there are some questions around those particular pieces. All right, then we've got Brecht, and he's a playwright, both an academic playwright, meaning he's analyzing theater and the role of theater, and then he's also writing plays. And he did not want theater to merely be a form of escapism. He wanted theater to actually intellectually evoke thought from the audience. You shouldn't sit there and just be entertained. You should actually be charged. You should be pushed. And I don't think necessarily into a particular political stance. In some cases, maybe with Brecht, but more often than not, it was that he just wanted to shock his audience into thinking. And then we have the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus was a school that would start in Germany that eventually would get banned by the Nazis and then would spread around the world. And the concept here, some of you have probably heard the phrase, everything is art. Well, they're going to add an everything is political to this notion of art. And so what would happen is that Germany, and this is in some of the videos in this unit, but German Nazis were in their nationalistic tendencies, were using very old font that would become kind of very typical Nazi fonts. And so, here today we can use Arial, we can use Times New Roman, and it doesn't really matter unless your teacher says it does. But the Bauhaus used an entirely new font that didn't follow the old tradition of German nationalistic fonts. And so even the fonts that were used in art or used in advertisements would become a political statement. So all of this is happening, and we have, obviously, this is the lead up to World War II. We have some dastardly charismatic leaders like Hitler and Mussolini who are going to propel this global conflict forward. We have economic forces at work. We have the forces of industrialism and modernity and scientific development all coming together, and we end up with World War II, the bloodiest, most violent global conflict in the history of humanity. And so, just to give you an idea, and these are loose numbers, but the global population around this time was 2 billion people. There's slightly over 2 billion people, but about 2 billion people. And by the end of the war, um, a lot of historians will put the war deaths at about 60,000, 80,000. But there are a lot of people who are now suggesting that those deaths are probably more around, oh, sorry, not thousand, million, 60 million, are more around 100 million. When you look at the deaths that, all the starvation and all of the various ancillary deaths that occur during a war that aren't always easy to count. And so now if we just play a little game here where we go through, we cross out zeros so that we see what this magnitude is. This war killed 1 out of 20 people worldwide. And so obviously in Europe, this number would have been quite a bit higher. Even in the United States, and we had a very decisive and important role, but in the whole scheme of the war, a fairly small role. And my grandmother, she was an Irish immigrant, and she came over as a very little girl. And on her street that she grew up on, every single boy, and they were big families. She lived with, families that would have many, many children. Every single young boy that she played with on her street by the time she was around 20 years old was dead and gone because of that street had been, they were in immigrant families. Lots of them went to the war. They were very disproportionately impacted compared to maybe other demographics. And so she said just on her street alone, she lost 20 or 30 young men who she'd grown up with. It was a big urban street at the time. But this war, and the reason I bring this up, because this is, the war fighting mostly with conventional weapons, but we have the Holocaust in there. We have Stalin purging entire segments of his population. We have the Americans. We did some pretty ugly things in the attempt to end the war. Not even Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'm referring to here, but firebombing of Dresden and firebombing of entire cities. When I was in Germany, I went to this place, Guggenau, and when I was there, now they produce these crazy trucks that I really like called Unimogs. They're these Mercedes off-road trucks, and they had a Unimog museum there when I went. But the reason that I went there was to see the Unimog museum. But what I didn't know, and I learned while I was there, is that Mercedes had been a airplane engine manufacturer for the Germans during the war. And when it was it was 3 towns connected by railroads. And the towns, I think there are about 20 or 30,000 people who live there. And they continued to produce the airplane engines right up to the end of the war. And as we were, the Americans were trying to, defeat Germany, we went in there and we firebombed these 3 towns that were the factories. And we literally leveled and killed everybody. We leveled everything. We firebombed the place. I think there was like 30 or 40,000 bombs. Like we dropped a massive bomb for every single inhabitant. It wasn't necessarily the intent to kill the inhabitants, but we needed to kill the modes of production of those airplane engines. And so this is what we have as total war. So while we didn't obviously as Americans, we didn't commit the atrocities that we could look at, like Stalin's purging and the gulags and that sort of thing of millions and millions of people that Stalin just thought didn't need to be in Russia, or Hitler in the case of the Holocaust with the Jews and the Gypsies and anyone that didn't fit into that German nationalistic identity. We didn't commit those things, but we very much at times participated in this new idea of total war. And in total war, you don't just go out onto the battlefield and fight the other army, which World War I, although there were civilians caught in the crossfire, was still 2 armies mostly fighting each other. When we get to World War II, that completely shifts. And now all of a sudden, civilian populations are completely part of the plan, annihilating civilian populations. The Germans bombed Berlin, I think it was for 57 days in a row. The Germans bombed London for 57 days in a row, and the English started bombing Berlin as a result. We firebombed Dresden. It's so not trying to apply any type of moral judgment here to these things, but war changes, and it changes the people, the soldiers, in the populations who experience this type of total war. And of course, it culminates with the end of the war in 1945 with the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which now creates total war was well understood, but these events create this iconic culmination where people realize that one plane with one bomb can kill hundreds of thousands of people. And the bombs that we used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be greatly outgunned within the next decades as we'd move into the Cold War. So this particular chapter in this particular unit, we're not as concerned about the impacts of total war and of the dropping of the bomb or just the development of nuclear technologies. But as we move into the next chapters, this is going to be everything. And these are going to be the things, this type of massive social impact of the death toll, the bomb, these notions of total war. This will shape the next 50 years of art and philosophy and music and culture. And it's going to be extremely impactful. I would say, even to this day, we are still the cultural, artistic byproducts of the impacts of World War II. So, going to study the lead up to World War II, what caused it, the politics and everything, the art that spun around that, some of the philosophy, and then after, in our next unit, we'll be looking at the post-war impacts. So, as always, if you have any questions, let me know.